Okay.
Hello, Louise. How are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm terrific. There are a number of things I want to start with to try and tease out why this book is so good. And I thought the first one I'd do would be to ask you to take us through the making of Cushla, imagining her, recreating her, adding to her, really sort of in the round, this character who's so memorable and I think so much at the center of this book.
I think a version of Cushla had maybe appeared in a story that I wrote a few years ago that's in the collection. It's called In Silhouette. And the character is younger. She's probably 17 or 18. And that story, I guess it spans about 40 years. And it's about a young one getting dressed up to go out. It sort of opens in a bar. And a stranger comes into the bar who she's quite taken with. But then her brother and his friends murder him. So, and she's sort of haunted with that for I guess of being associated with that, although she wasn't actually there. For the rest of her life. So I think that maybe it started with that. Maybe Cushla is like an amalgam of a lot of the young women who sort of reared me or who lived in our house. So my father. And mother, like my mother was 19 when she had me, so she would have been not much older than Cushla at that time. And I suppose a lot of the clothes that Cushla wears, and I guess the Carpenters appear and stuff. A lot of the soundtrack really is the soundtrack to my childhood. But I think there was maybe something else, that I had aunts who. And other women that I knew who were young Catholic women living in the north, and they were educated. I suppose, they were teachers, but at the same time, they were probably expected to live with their mothers until some nice upstanding Catholic chap turned up and married them. And I think maybe I was conscious of the fact that in the broader society, things have become a lot more permissive. And I guess that maybe I wanted to see what would happen if I threw temptation in the way of somebody like that.
I had a feeling sometimes that you didn't do research for the book, that you knew the things. I just want to give you one example, is the importance of the magazine Cosmopolitan for women of a certain type in a certain year. For example, Cushla discovers that the pill she's on, which is meant to regulate her periods, is in fact the pill. Mm-hmm. She finds this out in the pages of Cosmopolitan. Mm-hmm. And it's another moment where she buys it and her mother looks at it. But but that magazine, on one side it's glamorous, but on the other side, it's a portal, it's a way for women to find out a lot of things about their bodies or what's going on. I have a feeling you didn't have to look that up.
No, I did really have to look it up because that was actually still the case. Like I went to college in Dublin in 1984, and women's reproductive rights have only very recently been sorted out in this country. So I think for a lot of women, they did find out about things from Cosmopolitan. So it was certainly a thing in my day. But I also can remember, going into the newsagents, maybe with my mother or something on a Saturday, or later, with my pocket money, and seeing Cosmopolitan on the shelves. If I was maybe buying a copy of Jackie or something, and just the very sort of sexy, glamorous covers. And then later realizing that they did have all of this. It was like kind of a manual for being a young woman, really.
And do you see the book as an historical novel, in the sense that everything has changed since then? But let's forget about the North. We'll come back to that in a minute. But I mean that a young woman now, seeing an older man who's married come into a bar, would be much more wary and much more alert to the politics of the situation and who has power and who doesn't. But I think we genuinely see Cushla not occurring to her how little power she's going to have if she embarks on this.
The historical novel thing. I see what you mean. I mean, I have to say that in the beginning, I was a bit sort of like, what? When people said, you've written a historical novel, I was thinking, this happened in my lifetime. Like, what age am I? In fairness. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is a comment that particularly younger readers in the US have really picked up on the age difference and the politics of that, because yeah, I think these days, my daughter's in her early 20s. She'd be appalled if some old fella, tried to flatter her in a pub or something where she was working, But I do think that, I think I had a conversation with somebody about this where they didn't really get what, I suppose I wasn't trying to do anything, but I think that Michael's a bit of a sleazebag. But he's a sleazebag who does some good work in his professional life. But you wouldn't want to be married to him, and you certainly wouldn't want to be in your 20s and finding out that there've been a string of women like that, before you. But and also, I think elsewhere, there in the book, there's one scene where Cushla falls asleep on the couch and she wakes up and Michael Parkinson is interviewing Helen Mirren, and that video I think went viral a couple of years ago and people were appalled. But I actually remember seeing that on TV when we had a babysitter who didn't care what time we went to bed at, and even then, just wondering, I think I was probably about 7 or 8, but just not really quite understanding, but knowing there was something very wrong with the way that Parkinson spoke to her. But in the book, I have Cushla commenting that he's a dirty article, and the mother the mother says, or I'm sorry, get this right, that
Cushla says he's a dirty article, but the mother hasn't even noticed that.
Yeah, so the mother actually says dirty article, and Cushla presumes she's talking about Michael Parkinson, but actually she's talking about Helen Mirren because she's wearing a dress with like little skinny straps on it. So I think there's this kind of internalized misogyny, which I don't know if that's entirely gone away either. With Cushla's mother, and then there's probably, I don't know. There was just that sort of everyday sexism. It was so casual, that there were like women with big boobs on beer cans and all of those, images in newspapers and stuff like that as well. Yeah.
There's a question I could have easily started with, because it's one of the notable things with the book. It's one of the, I think technically for anyone who's writing or anyone who's studying the intricacies of writing, where you have a seamlessness in how you deal with dialogue, how you deal with things coming on the news. You don't use inverted commas, you don't use italics, you just simply let the narrative flow. It's a very, very difficult thing to do because tonally they're different. But oddly enough, they have to sit beside each other. In other words, you're saying what someone did, where someone went, a news bulletin coming directly as quotation, and someone speaking without any difference in the, I suppose, in the systems, like such as not inverted commas. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think it wasn't really a decision to introduce. A lot of the chapters begin with lines from a news bulletin, and sometimes these are heard on the radio or seen on television, but a lot of the time they're voiced by the children who Cushla teaches, because they do the news every morning, which because it's 1975 and very near Belfast, the kids are like we war reporters. So that wasn't really I think I wrote a few scenes. I began with writing a few scenes, and each one, when I really thought about that time and thought about what it was like, all of it was informed by this kind of, I guess it's a sign of anxiety, really, about the place that we lived in. And there's this anxiety that sort of clung to everyday life. So when I opened, with those lines, I guess I just presumed that that people would then, if it was in the classroom, that after a while the reader would know that that this was the children reciting the news, or there's maybe another chapter where there are a couple of lines like that, and then Cushla switches the radio off, and I sort of hoped that would be okay. And maybe the decision about dialogue and not using notation for the speech is just something that I started to do with the short stories from the outset, I think, because I don't know, I think the book is told in the third person, past tense, but I wanted it to be really close to Cushla's point of view. And I think I hoped that maybe by removing all the notation, and I did that with the stories as well, that it would maybe bed the dialogue kind of deeper down into the text and make it feel closer to the narrator or something.
I think it's important for the drama of the book exactly where the novel is set. In other words, it's not Belfast. It's not in a Catholic enclave or a Protestant enclave. It's in a place that is still mixed in some way. But of course, the mixture becomes more and more tense and things become more and more noticed. I think the first thing you notice there is how really uneasy Cushla is when she's in the room with Protestants only.
I have to say that that's really drawn very heavily from my early life, I suppose, because we lived in Hollywood, which was I never named Hollywood in it, but towards the end, I think I kind of forgot myself. I was determined to not name it, and then I think I kind of forgot myself. And I mentioned a statue that's at the bottom of the main street beside a playground. It's called Johnny the Jig. And as soon as I said that, people went, "Oh, that's Hollywood." So they all knew straight away. Hollywood was, I've had people who've been at pains to say to me, "Oh, you lived in Hollywood, like not much happened there," which is probably true compared with a lot of places. But there were a few incidents and they all seem to have affected my family. My grandmother was really badly injured in a bomb in 1971 and she was on her way to the bank. And then we had a bar that bombs were planted in a couple of times. I think that anxiety about being in Protestant company or something is, I think that my abiding memory of living in the North is of people clearly having to restrain themselves all the time from speaking their mind because you were always terrified of offending somebody. So I think that maybe that's where that anxiety comes from, because I do remember that very clearly. And also, this idea of Hollywood being mixed, it wasn't really mixed. Hollywood was 90% Protestant. And we were part of a very small Catholic community. And just to give you an idea of what that actually meant in terms of politics, and I don't even mean sort of I don't mean in terms of sort of orange or green politics. It was actually so it was so unionist stroke loyalist that in 1979, when it came to the first European Parliament elections, and it was obviously a much broader, bigger constituency, and my mother went in secret to a house where John Hume was going to be talking to people, because the place was so polarized. That even somebody like John Hume would have been seen as Republican. There wasn't even an Alliance Party candidate in the elections for Westminster and stuff. It was really a sort of strange place to live in some ways. So there was a lot of anxiety attached to all of that.
Yeah, and I think you work very well in the novel with the complexities of that. In other words, that there's a bar and you think, oh, well, surely bars, there's a loyalist bar and there's a Catholic bar. But in this place, this sort of fictional Hollywood, let's say, there's still a possibility in 1975 that there's a bar run by a Catholic in which British soldiers come to be served drink.
Yeah. Well, another thing which it has changed to an extent, and I think most of the reason for that is that the traditional industries have kind of gone, they've collapsed. But the Catholic middle class really, until pretty recently, was made up of publicans and bookies, a few doctors and a few solicitors. And the reason for that was that I think is that providing gambling and boozing services would have been considered to be immoral for Presbyterians. So they didn't want to be seen to engage in those sort of businesses. So those were the trades that were left to Catholics. And then I suppose what they did then was to educate their children. So that's where the doctors and lawyers came from. So as far as I could make out, that's kind of that was the Catholic middle class. So yeah, the vast majority of pubs in the North were run by Catholics.
And then you also have the small question of the school. Mm-hmm. And the school is another sort of, if there are a number of cauldrons that are boiling in the book, one being the pub, the other being the school, just give us your thinking around the creation of Slattery and Bradley.
So I think that I probably I was probably pretty young when I realised that we were part of a class system within a class system, because I think that's maybe often the case in societies that are quite divided. And within our small Catholic community, there was definitely a hierarchy. And I do remember from my primary school, which is very, very similar to the school that Cushla teaches in, that at one stage there was a fire and brimstone priest who had very strong sectarian views, who used to come in and terrorize us. So there's one story that he tells that actually was told in my class by a priest. But then also there did seem to be families who were very much kind of on the margins. And I just noticed that maybe there wasn't as much kindness as you might have hoped, that it wasn't like we were all downtrodden together. But I think that this was maybe the case in all systems. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah, and I think there's something particularly hard about Bradley in the sense that he really wants to keep, he wants to keep a cover on everything. So Cushla, when she's driving the kid home, for example, or she's being especially kind to the kid, Bradley's sort of watching from a window. Slattery is watching from a window.
Yeah.
And they don't want that. That's a disruption of some sort of, that there should be very close relationships between, say, teachers and students. But more than that, between teachers and that particular family. And so there's a whole sense of Cushla being watched by these two men.
Yeah. I think maybe that was influenced by things that weren't even necessarily from the north. I think I remember when I was maybe I was still in school in the 80s. I really vividly remember what happened to Eileen Flynn, where she lost her job over being with a man who she wasn't married to, and just how hard the church did come down on people who were perceived to be not towing the line or something, because a lot of that really was about control.
And so it's a very important matter in the north, even still, isn't it? The whole matter of sectarian education and the church's interest in holding on to that. Mm-hmm. But I mean, something.
Yeah, it is still. But I mean, so I think that we left in 1979, and I think that Lagan College, which was the first integrated secondary school, opened a year or two after that. So there wasn't any option so I did a year in a secondary school in the north, in a wee tiny grammar school in Holywood, and the schools were all, as far as I could make out, were religious. They were either Catholic or Protestant, and it's sort of a strange thing. My parents, for example, wouldn't have been, they weren't very devout Catholics. Like we never did family rosaries or anything like that. When we moved to the south, I kind of couldn't believe that. I remember going to a friend's house, and at 6 o'clock, you're looking at a row of backsides when everybody's like dropped to the floor, because we never had anything like that. But I think that with the schools, in the 70s, I think in the 80s, and I'm not sure when it changed, but I know that it has changed. Gaelic games results were never, ever, ever covered on the BBC. The Irish language was never ever used on the BBC. And if you were from, where a lot of us, who would have identified as Irish and had been educated with that or grown up with that, it had the effect of not just making you feel, excuse me, invisible, but also it made those interests seem somehow subversive. And I think that maybe the schools were a way of not just preserving religion, but of continuing those or holding on to those traditions or aspects of culture.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. Then, isn't it? In the that the Michael and his friends, being liberal Protestants, the thing they want to do ostensibly, they say they want to do, is learn Irish, which would be a very big move for them.
Well, you see, it isn't. There were things that I used to be fascinated about. Like I remember hearing when I was about 10 or 11 that there were some people in Hollywood who were learning Irish, and they would have been like Michael and his friends, these sort of well-heeled, sort of vaguely bohemian people who were learning Irish. And I remember going home and mentioning this to my father, who was like, what the hell would they be learning Irish for? But I think I do think that those characters in the book are kind of playing at being Irish, except for Michael. I think with him, it's genuine because, he went to college in Dublin. Like vast numbers of Northern Protestants went to Trinity, and they were very familiar with Dublin. Whereas I think the others are kind of messing. He seems to be the only one who's really doing his homework.
Yeah. Tell me, was I wrong to spot Jerry as gay very early in the book?
You're the only person who did. So your gaydar is obviously very, very
Hold on a
strong.
minute. Am I really?
Not one other everybody was at the end went, oh God, is he gay? Nobody else flagged that at all. I swear to God.
I don't believe you.
And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be gay until, Jerry wasn't gay until like draft 2 or something. So yeah.
But I mean, that first scene where he almost kisses her, when he takes her home, was that deliberately there? I mean, so the minute it happened, I said, "Oh, Jerry's gay."
Did you?
Yeah.
That's hilarious. No, I think I had it that Jerry was just Jerry actually was a lot less appealing in ways than probably in the first draft, and so Jerry was like way more nervous, like sort of nervous to the point of being like kind of slimy and glistening with the stress of taking Cushla out, and actually I think that he was probably trying it on with her for a good bit longer. And I think that in the first draft, I think she might have gone off them or something a couple of times.
I mean, it suited her to have him there because she could always claim that he was the one she was going to Dublin with, satisfying her.
Well, you see, that's really funny you should say that because somebody said to me a while ago, and I was kind of mortified. I was still reading in Belfast, and this woman put her hand up and said, "Why does Cushla not have any friends?" And I said, well, she does have a friend. She has Jerry. But what the woman meant was that why does Cushla not have any female friends? So for about the first 4 or 5 drafts, Cushla did have a friend called Christine, and Christine was getting married and was this like kind of nightmare bridezilla type. And Cushla used to go and meet her in Belfast sometimes, and they'd sit and eat like custard tarts and then Christine would go and throw up because she was anorexic, and then Cushla would go home on the train. And my editor said that Christine was kind of performing the same function as Jerry, except that she was too far away from the action, and also that Jerry was a plausible alibi for her, disappearances and stuff. So that's kind of, Jerry ended up being kind of an amalgam of those two characters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lovely moment where I think it's Jerry, correct me if I'm wrong, who hears Michael saying mustache, which is sort of a posh.
Oh, it's Eamon, the brother. Mustache.
And he says, it might be a bit of a flute. Yeah. And I just love that idea that Michael, who's the flute?
He says, I think he's all right. And then he says something like mustache, and I think he's a flute.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting idea, that she doesn't have a friend in Belfast that she can go in and see. That if you take that friend away, you isolate her. Mm-hmm. Now, you make this plausible by simply the matter that she went home. Mm-hmm. After teacher training college, she went home. And home was just far enough away in a city that, in a place that wasn't that easy to move around in anyway. It wasn't as, and that she got more and more isolated, even over a year or two, even over 1 year, with her mother, with the death of her father, with her brother, that home is where the heart breaks. Home becomes a sort of prison. Mm-hmm. And the notion that that anyone who would see her anywhere would have to say to her, get out now. You cannot look after your mother in the way you're doing. You cannot work part-time at your brother's bar. You cannot work in that school. There's no one to say that to her. So she treat all of that as normal. In other words, she begins to sort of, I suppose, perform her own imprisonment in a way that seems natural to her. So I think it's essential that she doesn't have another, a friend who's advising her or a friend who's getting married. I think that would, in a way, weaken the power of the book, which is her isolation seeming so natural. Mm-hmm. I know that's not a question, but if you
I know what you mean. Yeah, I think you see, it was quite easy to get isolated and cut off. Where we lived, it was literally 5 miles from Belfast, but it just felt like a world away. And my mother's mother lived on the Crumlin Road, so it was above Ardoyne, a bit north of Ardoyne, and for about 3 or 4 years, my mum used to pick us up from school and go to check on her mother. Gina, Cushla's mother, is kind of an amalgam of both my grandmothers, who both had very healthy, or unhealthy, should I say, healthy appetites for drink, just unhealthy drinking habits, I guess. And so we used to go and see her. And I think I was really conscious quite early of the extent to which geography, and probably class to an extent, although I wouldn't have known really that's what it was, seemed to affect your experience of the troubles. So people really very much where they could retreated into their own areas and didn't really come out again. And the people who had to live in interface areas just closed the doors and hope for the best, you know. And so that trip to her house used to take us through Ardoyne, which I don't know any other way to describe it except that it was kind of in a state of intifada for about 4 or 5 years. You know, the riots seem to be just constant. You know, there's a scene. I think in the opening of the book, I describe a scene, you know, the opening part of the news where a child climbs up the side of a Saracen personnel carrier, pokes a stone in. So I saw that happen so many times. Like, you know, these were kids who weren't like much older than us and stuff as well. So I know that definitely my parents kind of lost touch with people a bit, you know. I think they all thought that we were just like traipsing through, you know, meadows of wildflowers in Hollywood or something. You know, where
I think this is essential for the plot, even in another way, that it has to be fully plausible that she falls for Michael. And one of the ways it's fully plausible is that there isn't anything else. It isn't as though she's going to dances or there are parties with friends. She's simply isolated with her drunken mother. She's teaching in this school, and here is someone who starts to look at her, and she finds him handsome. And therefore you think, well, this is obviously what she's going to do, because she's going to need him so badly, because really around her there are no other possibilities.
Yeah, I think so. And that really was the case. That, you know, my parents would talk very fondly about all the dances that they used to go to in the 60s and stuff. But by the 70s, that was completely gone. All of that was gone. Yeah. The city centre was closed off. So there were no pubs in the city centre. Any of the other pubs were, I mean, I remember probably it was in the 80s. I was still a student and going to the north and going to a table quiz on the Ormo Road. And so, you know, people had started to take tables, and we sat in front of the window and were told to get away from there. You know, so even to not sit inside the window of a bar in particular areas in case somebody come and spray it with bullets. So all of those things had just made it very difficult for people to go out, you know. So, there is.
And then you have to create Michael. In other words, you can't make him fully irresponsible. That you can't. Obviously, he has to have a sort of intelligence that interests her as much as physically he interests her. So in making him a liberal barrister, you actually give us another drama then, which is within that world of Protestant privilege, there's an argument going on.
There is. And I think, you see, like my in-laws, for example, are Protestants from Derry who went to Trinity, and my father-in-law went on civil rights marches. He used to go home at weekends to go on civil rights marches. Now, my father never went to a civil rights march. Do you know what I mean? I sort of didn't want to, there are these sort of accepted binaries of, you know, Catholics do this and Protestants do that. And I wanted to get away from that a little bit. People involved in the civil rights movement, they weren't all Catholic in the beginning. And also, I'm really interested in the fact that Presbyterians, although I think a lot of them don't realise it because of the way that history is taught or not taught in schools in the North, actually come from this really great liberal tradition. If you look at, the 1798, that rebellion really was in the North led by Ulster Presbyterians, which is kind of interesting. So I think that's where I brought in that book, Betsy Gray and the Hearts of Down. There's a mention of that.
You make this schoolroom experience very interesting, very sweet.
I think I think Cushla in the classroom is probably very much based on a teacher I had when I was about 7 or 8 called Miss McKenna, who used to do mad things where like nobody was bringing a lot of cultural capital into the room, but she'd play a Mozart horn concerto and get us to write something. And we were just writing either nothing or looking out the window or, but if you did write anything, she'd tell you were amazing. So, I mean, some of that was based on her. And I think she probably was particularly kind to some of the kids who were maybe, there was in Hollywood, there was a big estate very much like the one that the McGohns lived in. And I think the kids who lived there, some of them would have been in mixed marriages and they were getting a pretty hard time and she would have been quite kind to a lot of those kids as well.
I think for anyone who's been a teacher, there's always a student that got away, someone who could have been brilliant, who could have gone on to do anything and just slipped out one day, didn't come back into class. And it broke your heart because you thought, if only something had been done that day. Mm-hmm. And obviously you have this oddly attractive older brother of Davy, who's the kid who's really who's really sweet and needy and affectionate. But his older brother is slightly distant, and he's sort of sexual and he's watchful. I think he's a sort of brilliant creation.
I don't really know. You see, there were lots of things that I didn't know about him. I think with subsequent drafts, he became a lot more important. And I think it was maybe quite a few drafts before, maybe it was the second or third draft before I realised that he was going to have such a huge part in I suppose, what's the plot and what happens to Michael. So that sort of came out in the writing of it.
Yeah, I mean that you're making it clear that there was one way for someone like him to go, mm-hmm. and it was, that it was into joining one of the organizations, whereas his younger brother is much softer fellow. Mm-hmm. He's much more sweet, and he really is being damaged really badly. Mm-hmm. Not only by what's happening at home, because the house is the only sort of mixed mm-hmm. house in a housing estate, but also what's happening at school. That there's a creepy business of slattery, mm-hmm. Whispering into his ear. There's a moment of, I think it would be an astonishing moment in a film, but it's astonishing enough in your book, we don't need a film for this, is when he gives him a much longer, Slattery gives him, at their first confession, a much longer penance than the others.
Okay, so I got that. So that with the crazy priest that we had, I got a very long penance because he didn't like my family. This actually happened. So I was my penance was about half an hour long, and actually my mother called me out of the pew.
And you mean that everybody would notice how long your penance was going on for? I think you must have
people notice how long your penance was, though. Do you remember that? Like, people did actually remember how long your penance was.
Yeah, and then it's going. They tended to be good. Like, it was with 3 Our Fathers or something. You went away.
Yeah.
I never saw that, but I know that if it was first confession, mm-hmm. and if one was singled out in that way, it's a very dramatic thing. But there is a creepiness in the priest. I mean, nothing happens, but it isn't as though the priest is not moving towards grooming or in some direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of a bit worried about that because I just thought there was quite enough going on without poor Davy being abused as well. So, and I just didn't want to try and, I didn't want to deal with, I think I didn't want to just, lob it in and not deal with it properly. So I kind of didn't go that far, but who knows, maybe he was grooming him.
But I mean, I think that's subtle in the book, where there are a number of things. One of them is that you just have it there. It's just the way things are, mm-hmm. but you don't dramatize it. It doesn't. I mean, he doesn't become an abuse victim. The boy, there's mm-hmm. enough going on, as you say. The other one, of course, is Jerry. That you don't have Jerry coming out in the middle of class, or that you don't make Jerry. But you don't make that issue. You don't give it any importance in the book. No, mm-hmm. As you say, there's enough happening. You don't need side dramas because the central drama has to remain really strong and sort of passionately there.
Yeah, because it was like sometimes it was sort of hard to keep all the balls in the air because there was the Cushla and Michael story, and then there was Cushla's life at work and the relationship with the McGahern family, and it was sort of hard to. I think it took a good few drafts to try and get what I felt was a balance between those, and just to keep them both going, and then to have them going somewhere in the end. And that was hard enough without throwing in a load of other stuff as well.
I thought you made Gina, who's the mother, with great complexity, where she's not just a drunk. For example, we see her in the bar, where she's actually very good. There's a moment where you say she really knew how to manage a bar, because obviously that was what she was doing all her life. She also is sometimes very modern and with it in the way she dresses or moves.
Yeah.
So in the middle of the whole thing, she just wants to soak up as much gin as she can get. And I hope that is water. She is another aspect. Yeah. But she is another aspect of the prison.
In the which?
Nonetheless. she's another aspect of the prison. She's one of Cushla's prisoners, or one of Cushla's
jailers.
Jailers.
Yeah, she is, absolutely. So I mean, I'm sure all of you have met women like this. I think there's something maybe with Gina, which is that there's a part where Cushla reflects on, she's driving past her father's home, like her kind of paternal grandfather's house on the Malone Road. So they would have been Catholics who, I suppose, got out of poverty a generation earlier, and she recalls that Gina used to say, "I married above myself." And there was a woman who I knew probably of that generation who used to say that. And I suppose Gina was a good-looking Millie, which is how she would have been described in Belfast, who ended up, doing okay for herself by marriage. And she's far from stupid, but she's widowed quite young. But the business doesn't go to her. It goes to her fairly unpleasant son, Eamon. And there's kind of nowhere for her to go with any of it. And I think she's isolated too, because her sisters, and in my head, are all living in Belfast and still seeing each other, but she's kind of moved away in terms of class and is quite isolated from that point of view. And I think, for maybe women of her generation, that a lot of their respectability probably came from the marriages they made. And if they were gone, then they were just alone.
I didn't see Eamon as that unpleasant as much as under extraordinary pressure, because it must be clear if you own a bar, you get to hear a lot. You get to know, why is somebody not coming in today? I mean, by the way, I love your character has an egg inside his jacket to go home and cook. That's just a great detail. I love it. But he gets to know a lot about his customers and the silences and the things said and the news coming on television, how everyone responds. So in a way, he sees what's coming. Eamon does. And he just seems to me constantly harassed and worried, and all he's trying to do is keep this bar going.
I mean, I suppose, my family had a bar that my granny ran, I suppose, but really my two uncles ran it, and my father never worked in it, but my father was studying. He trained to be an accountant. He never wanted to work in a pub. But before they had the pub, my grandfather was a bookie. So my father loved being a bookie, but he didn't want to work in a bar. So my mother used to work a few shifts a week in the pub in the evenings. And I think that there was that anxiety. Some of those. I mean, the story is complete fiction, but the scene with the Paras that happened. There were other things. There were so many things that if I'd put them all in the book, people would have been going, for God's sake, because they were just so ridiculous. I don't know. I mean, I think that the way he is in the bar, he's maybe not too unpleasant, but there's a scene on Easter Sunday where he says, where they're all talking about where Cushla was the previous night. He is a bit dismissive of her.
Yeah, and there was that sense, I think, in the 70s into the 80s of Northerners coming to Dublin and just looking around and saying, where is the security? And the fact that you could go anywhere. You've got a wonderful picture of Wynn's Hotel in Middle Abbey Street. But more than that, I think it's the picture of just coming into a city that isn't under siege. And it isn't just they're having a weekend together, but they're having a weekend away from all the pressure.
I think for a lot of Northerners, Dublin was very much like that, but then, I think there was that. But then there were other things that I kind of figured later on, I suppose the main time that a lot of Northern nationalists or Catholics would get away from the North would be around the 12th of July. And, so you go to the South where people aren't singing about being up to their knees in your blood and various other things. Which is what you'd have to put up with if you lived anywhere near a parade, which we did. So there was that. But I think that then, when we were moving to the South in 1979, I didn't really want to move and begged my parents to put me in a boarding school. And they said that if we were moving, everybody was moving, because we were probably quite rightly realised that, I'd be basically moving out of home at the age of 12, which they weren't really ready for. And they really sold it to us that we were coming to the promised land or something. because I suppose because of the sort of area that we lived in, where we were mostly going around the place, kind of pretending not to be anything, and trying not to offend people. But then when we did come to live in the South, I think I saw it maybe in a different way. That it did seem to be a very closed theocracy and very homogenous, but not in a particularly great way in 1979 as well. So that was kind of interesting.
If I was writing a story about you, I would have you coming out one night from work, from the kitchen for a smoke outside, and someone else being there, and the two of you talking. You go back in, and the other person turning to say, you should be a writer. You should write all that down. Have you ever thought of that? Now, did that ever happen?
I probably did a few times. Yeah, I was wasting all my best lines and mulligans of Pullbeck Street for about 20, not 20 years, about 10 years. Yeah.
And did you write anything down?
No, I wrote nothing. I didn't write anything. I always read a lot. I read probably about 3 books a week since I was about 3. So, but I never wrote. I think I thought that you had to be like magical or something to write.
And when did that change?
I think it changed when I spent about 5 weeks after my very first kind of reluctant visit or attendance at a writing group. When I agreed to write a short story, presuming that the others would tell me it was shite and like free me from the shame of having to try and write another one. But I think that I think it changed when maybe I just figured it wasn't really about whether anybody liked it or whether it was any good or anything. Although I did want to be good at it. I think Una Mannion, my friend Una Mannion, was in the writing group, and I think I really wanted her to approve of anything that I wrote. So she was a great motivator. But I think that I just think that something kind of shifted in me or something. I don't know what it was. I think it was maybe something about language, because I don't speak the way that I talk in my head. Sounds nuts. Because I have a Southern accent, So I think that when I write the way that I speak in my head, which is like a Northerner.
The prose, that, as I said it earlier, there's a seamlessness in the way you can move from one tone into another. But there's also, I think, there's a sort of naturalness. It's the sound of breath is how you make the sentences and how you make the dialogue. So I suppose the question is, did this come at the start then? You sat down to write this story. Yes, I get the thing about Una Mannion, that all you need is one person to read it for you, and you want that one person to actually not be embarrassed and say, I didn't want to tell you, but this is the worst. So you want that to work, but then you just sit down and do it. So she's
the person who tells me, like, I would trust her with my life. So if I write something, the way when you're writing, sometimes something's a bit hard and you fix it up a bit and you think you've got away with it, and then she'll read it and that'll be the one line she'll say, there's something not right here. So she always knows she never got away with anything. So she's like always that person, like more than my editor or anything. I hope she never sees this, but more than anybody. But
and when you're talking about drafting, do you do a full draft, or do you mess about? I mean, just that you fix what's wrong rather than doing another full draft.
I did a full draft with this because I didn't know what else to do really, and it was maybe about the circumstances, that I around the time that I tried to write it. So I found out I had melanoma and I had surgery, and I knew I was going to be off work for about 2 or 3 months, and I watched all of Call My Agent, and then I watched in about 2 days, and I was on painkillers, and then I watched a lot of The Wire, and actually Michael is kind of based on Dominic West, because I was perfect on him for a lot of the first. For a lot of the
you weren't alone in that, I think.
What?
You weren't alone in that.
Exactly. So so I just to avoid thinking about whether I was dying or not, and to get my arse out of the chair and stop watching TV, I thought, well, okay, maybe you're not going to have like loads of years to write a novel. or to go around saying I'm writing a novel when I wasn't actually really doing anything except listening to the Carpenters or something, and watching ridiculous videos about the RUC. So I made a deal with myself that I'd try and write 1,000 words a day. And the other part of that was, and I knew I wouldn't be able to do that, but I did it. I did manage to turn up at the desk often enough that I had about 65,000 words after about 10 weeks. But the other thing that I did was to force myself not to look back and just to keep pushing forward with the story. And like that draft was a shocking mess. It was very bad. Like the tense kept changing and characters' names were changing and some of the times their religion was changing and it was just horrendous. And the second draft took a very long time just because I had a lot of cleaning up to do. But I didn't approach the short stories like that at all. Like I just kind of inched my way through. And I think maybe because I had a less clear idea of what they were about or something. The other way with the story, it can be very elusive or something, the idea. Sort of
that in a way drafting won't help.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get it, you don't get it. You know,
exactly.
Whereas with a novel, you can actually just do it again. Things can work. I suppose another question is, and this is a hard question to ask, formulate. It's a hard one to answer. Is do you think that there's a sort of unconscious thing now for all of us on the island, but especially people who are in the north, that it won't go away? That it's bubbling under, that it's in our minds in all sorts of funny ways, all sorts of fearful ways, and that it's going to come, that it's not as though 1975 is historical. It's actually locked into our DNA.
Yeah, I don't think it's gone away at all.
Novel.
Yeah, I don't think it's gone away. I mean, the year that the novel is set is 1975, so it's a year after the Ulster Workers' Council strike. And there's a passage in the book where Cushla remembers things that happened during the strike. So every single one of those things happened, you know, to my family. I mean, just like, you know, my immediate family during the strike. So we were stopped by a neighbour with a gun at a roadblock who pretended not to know us. Yeah, there were all kinds of things like that. And
someone brought you milk. Someone brought you milk in a Lucasade bottle.
And the milk in the Lucasade bottle. And I can remember my because there'd been there was no food. Like the shops were closed. There was no electricity. Like towards the end of it, it was really pretty bad. And you couldn't really go anywhere because there were roadblocks. So it had become very heavily paramilitarized. And really, from our point of view, it looked as though nobody was really doing anything about that, which is kind of weird. You know, the roadblocks were just there. Nobody was trying to take them down. You know, the security forces didn't intervene. So I think that there was definitely a feeling after that had been a very genuine attempt at power sharing. I mean, the Ulster Workers' Council strike started with the Dublin bombings. That was on the first day of the Ulster Workers' Council strike. So there was a very clear message in there, you know, like the slogan was Dublin's just a Sunningdale away. And but if you look at it, so there was a, you know, then direct rule just went back, they just gave up and it went back to Westminster for a very long time. But there's no government there now. You know, the DUP are talking with a straight face about stakeholders who are actually loyalist paramilitaries. You know, I think there are a lot of things to be kind of concerned about, and I don't think it's gone away really. I think there's been, I think as well that the good effects of the Good Friday Agreement really haven't been felt in a lot of areas. And again, it's the same thing that I always thought, that geography and class have an awful lot to do with it.
Louise, thank you very much for the book, and thanks very much for the conversation. It's really good of you to come.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks a million.
Looking forward to your next book.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.